Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Facebook Live broadcast of a year in the life of the hummingbirds. Please do not click on any of the links that you're seeing on some of our posts. We're having a problem with spammers bombing our website, and we apologize for that. We're deleting those links as fast as you can, but you should just come to the Georgia Audubon Facebook page to get started with this presentation. I'm Dottie Head. I'm the Director of Membership and Communications for Atlanta Audubon. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming to our online event. We have a couple of announcements to make. On September the 13th, we're going to be offering a webinar. It's going to be a virtual wildlife sanctuary tour. And on September 17th, we're going to be hosting Doug Tallamy, author of Bringing Nature Home, and a new book called Nature's Best Hope, a new approach to conservation that starts in your yard. He'll be doing a Facebook webinar, or not a Facebook, but a webinar with us on Thursday, September 17th in the evening, and we hope you will join us. We've also got registration open for our Georgia Bird Fest on our website. We will post links to all of these events once we get this event started, but you can find them all on our website at georgiaaudubon.org. And if you're enjoying all this free content that we're offering, we hope you will consider making a donation or becoming a member. And we're going to put a link for how you can make a donation to contribute to the care of Sibley, our ambassador hummingbird, who we're going to feature later in this presentation. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our Director of Education, Melanie Furr, who is our handler for Sibley, and she's going to take this presentation away. So Melanie, it's all you.
Thanks, Dottie, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. We had a great response posting this on Facebook, and we're delighted you can join us. This is definitely the time of year to be looking out your window and enjoying hummingbirds, because migration, we're kind of at the start of the peak migration time for hummingbirds, and we're going to be seeing more and more in these next few weeks. And there are more birds in the fall than there are in spring, or any other time of year for that matter. And we'll learn all about that today. And I know that a lot of you are probably tuned in primarily to see our special guest, Sibley, Georgia Audubon's hummingbird ambassador. And he will be joining us at the end of the slideshow. So stay tuned to meet Sibley. Dottie probably doesn't even realize she did it, but she said Atlanta Audubon when she first greeted everyone. So if you haven't heard the good news, the big news, we are now Georgia Audubon, expanding our work across the state. So we would love to have everyone join us. But without further ado, we are going to take off on the year in a life of a hummingbird, and specifically the ruby-throated hummingbird. So here we have pictures of some ruby-throated hummingbirds. And if you are not aware, the ruby-throated hummingbird is Georgia's only breeding hummingbird. We do get other vagrant, migrant birds in Georgia during the late fall, winter months, some other species. But during the breeding months, spring, summer, and early fall, what you're seeing at your feeders and chasing each other away from your feeders are ruby-throated hummingbirds, and they can look very different in different lights, and we'll talk about that too. So in these pictures, as I mentioned, they're all ruby-throated hummingbirds. We've got the male. He is the one who sports the ruby throat for which the species is named. Here we have a female. She does not have any ruby throat feathers at all. She's going to want to blend in with her nest and be more camouflaged. And then here, as you maybe can guess, we've got a juvenile male, a baby boy, if you will, with just that little bit of ruby speckling starting to come in. So we're going to start off in spring when hummingbirds arrive on their breeding grounds here in Georgia and throughout the eastern seaboard, from the Mississippi River east, from Florida all the way up into Canada is their breeding range. And here's a map actually of their breeding range. So that peach color is their breeding habitat, breeding territory. The yellow indicates some migration, some of their migration route. and the blue is their wintering grounds. So in spring, they start to arrive. We'll talk more about their migration a little later in the presentation. And they are setting up territories and getting ready for the breeding season. Their courtship displays are very elaborate. It's the males who will arrive first, and they will set up territories. The females will arrive a few weeks later. And the male, I've got a video here to show you. This is not a ruby-throated hummingbird, but it does give you a good idea of the breeding displays of a hummingbird.
Both birds are looking for a partner, but the choice of mate will be hers. It's up to him to impress her. He moves in close, hovering directly in front of her, rocking his entire body back and forth in a display of flying prowess. His back shimmers with green. It's not until we get her point of view that we see his true splendor. He flexes the iridescent feathers of his mantle until they become a glowing mask of violet. Facing into the blazing sun, he swoops back and forth, his face a fiery flower before her. How can she possibly resist him? And yet she does, leaving him to return to his perch. Perfecting his performance is going to take some practice.
That was a great nature documentary. So the male will perform these displays where they fly in these arcing motions, flaring their gorgets, which is the birding term for those ruby throat feathers. That video showed a Costa's hummingbird, but you might notice a ruby-throated doing something very similar. Their gorgets don't have quite the tails as the Costas, but they can flare them similarly. As I mentioned, it's only the males who have those ruby throat feathers. And that iridescence that we see is actually just a trick of the light. The picture that we see on top here is the back side of the feather, which shows you the actual color of the feather. It's really just kind of a slaty gray color. It's when you turn it over and the light is hitting it that you can get not just ruby colors, but they can look green or gold and sometimes even black, depending on the way light is hitting it. So I get questions a lot. Atlanta Audubon staff gets questions a lot about other hummingbirds that people think they've seen at their feeder that might be a different species because it looks black or it looks gold or purple. But most of the time, if it's spring or summer, it's going to be just a ruby-throated with those throat feathers deceiving us. Here is Sibley. So this is a little preview of Sibley. He's showing you how whether his face is turned into the light or away from the light, those feathers can look black or that very iridescent, brilliant ruby color. So there he's turned on, off. On, back on. A little wing flutter there. But you can see the throat feathers are really that black color. There's no ruby pigment at all. So inside each feather are these tiny bubbles, if you will, microscopic, and they are reflecting light in different ways. And that's what makes us see the colors. So if the male is successful in attracting a female, She will take over all the work and care from there. He has no other part in nesting or raising the young. So she builds the nest on her own. That can take 10 days or a couple of weeks. Imagine trying to build a nest with just that tiny little beak that she has, carrying things in her beak, maybe in her tiny little feet. But she'll put the nest together and camouflage it with lichens and mosses. You can see in this lower corner that key is there just to give you a sense of scale. Females will lay two eggs, 99 times or more out of 100. They are laying 2 eggs. And if the young hatch, you can see in these photos here, she will do all of the care. So the male, as I said, he has no part in raising of the young. He is probably already off trying to woo another female. But she is a very dedicated mother. She will incubate the eggs for about 3 weeks, and then she will tend the chicks in their nest for about 3 more weeks. And you can see that she inserts her bill really far down into their throat to get that food down in there. She'll fly around nectaring and also catching insects for protein to bring back and feed to her young. Here's another picture of a nest, and with a quarter or maybe a silver dollar there for scale. So again, just you can see how tiny these birds are. Here's a little video of a female coming in to feed her young. You'll notice that the baby's bills are much shorter than the mother's. And as they open, you'll notice they're bright yellow too. That's called a gape. That open mouth is the bird's gape. And that bright yellow helps to serve as a flag or a signal to mom to feed her babies. They'll keep that gape for a few weeks after they're out of the nest to sort of help mom be guided in to feed them. And here's a little interesting behavior that they're programmed to do from hatching. You might notice that that little one stuck his little booty over the side of the nest and ejected his urine. So they don't make a mess in their nest. They are programmed as soon as they hatch to sort of put their backside over the side of the nest when they need to excrete waste. So during summer, mom is busy tending her young in the nest and then after they've fledged. And you can see here those babies with those bright orange beaks. That baby on the bottom right was a bird in rehab. I do a lot of volunteer bird rehabilitation for injured and orphaned birds. So that was an orphaned hummingbird. But you can see that short little yellow open bill. And in the wild, mom flies around continuing to feed her babies for a few weeks. So breeding season is wrapping up, pretty much over now in Georgia. You probably are seeing young fledglings at your feeder. For the most part, moms have probably said sayonara, adios, and are not providing care anymore. The babies are on their own, maybe even starting to move south. So during summer months, once they're out of the nest, and then the males, of course, throughout the summer, and the females, they have to spend all day, every day eating. They have a tremendously fast metabolism. And so they have to eat every 15 to 30 minutes throughout the day, and they are just burning those calories rapidly. They don't drink soft drinks, and I don't recommend putting soft drinks out for them, but to give you a sense of what their metabolism is, if we burned the calories that they burned during the course of a day for 12 hours a day, we would need to drink a can of Coke every single minute. So these birds lead a very high-paced and high fueled life. They get a lot of their fuel and energy from flowers, nectaring from flowers. They particularly like these tubular shaped flowers. Red, of course, is easy for them to see, but your flowers don't have to be red. Your feeders don't have to be red to attract a hummingbird. They get a lot of their diet also from insects. So none of us can survive on sugar alone. They do catch small flying insects. You can see there that bird opening wide to catch a little fruit fly or a gnat. They mostly catch their insects on the wing. They have a hard time gleaning insects off of leaves. And I've been able to observe that firsthand with Sibley, Georgia Audubon's ambassador bird, because I've tried giving him fruit flies or even not flighted fruit flies that he would readily be able to pick up. And he looks at those with disdain. He wants no part of picking up an insect. But if I dangle a little spider in front of him, his bill opens wide and he is ready to gulp it down. So most of the hunting that they do, they're going to be doing in flight. And of course, if you put out a feeder, they will readily come to feeders. And I'll give you the best recipe for filling your feeders later on. So I mentioned that high-paced lifestyle that has a high fuel requirement. Hummingbirds do have a little bit of a safety security blanket, if you will. They have an anatomical feature called a crop. Several birds have it. Birds of prey typically have a crop because it can be feast or famine for a bird like a hawk. So if they get a big rabbit, they need a place to store it. Similarly, for a hummingbird, they've got a crop where they can store excess nectar. If they've got a good patch of flowers, they can really fill that crop to bulging. And the only reason we can see this on Sibley, this is a photo of Sibley when he was still just a baby. He had recently been injured and come into my care. He was molting and he had a little bald patch on his throat. So that lets us see this translucent pouch there, which he had filled to bulging with his favorite nectar, which is just the sugar water that I put in my feeders. So for drinking that nectar, they've got an amazing tongue. It's long, it's fast, it laps nectar up to 12, or actually 12 or more laps per second. It's very long, as you can see, for reaching into those long tubular flowers. And when it's retracted in their head, it has to wrap around their skull to fit inside their head. So here is Sibley, our Georgia Audubon ambassador bird, catching a spider. I mentioned earlier that he scoffs at fruit flies if they're hopping around his enclosure, but if a dangling spider comes his way, he is all over it. So he notices it immediately. I'll usually get a twig or a pencil to dangle it on the web. So he spots it. This is in slow motion, by the way. There's that tiny little spider. You might be able to make it out. And he snatches it. So in real time, that took 2 seconds or less. But in slow motion, you can really see how wide his gape is for catching.
Hey, Melanie, can I interrupt? Can you tell people how the mothers feed the parent birds feed the young? Do they take nectar to them or do they take insects?
They take both. So they'll fill up that crop that I was mentioning, that pouch under their throat. They'll fill it up with nectar and fill it up with insects. And then as the video showed, they will put their beak deep inside the throat of their baby and regurgitate the food in their crop. So before we start talking about their migration, just show you some behaviors. So hummingbirds spend a lot of time eating, as I mentioned. They love their baths. They bathe daily. They can't walk. Their legs are too short, so they're not going to wade into water. They primarily bathe by sort of wiggling themselves around on wet leaves, either wet from rain or dew. And this is a video of Sibley enjoying his daily bath. I will mist a leaf. And I will mist him as well. and he can just sort of shimmy around and take his bath that way. And in the wild, a bird would be hovering, flying, maybe perching lightly on the leaves, but would be doing something similar for taking baths. Feather care is super important because, of course, those feathers are helping them accomplish their amazing feats of flight, but also keeping them warm, helping them, the males, of course, with their breeding displays. You might notice on Sibley, he's got a few little spiky white feathers on his head in some of the photos and videos. And when he molts, the new feathers growing in, they're called pin feathers. And it's just the new shaft emerging before the actual fluffy part of the feather emerges. And yeah, here you can see some of those little pin feathers growing in. This is an old video of Sibley preening. So of course, after you take a bath, it's very important to put those feathers back in place. And also they will spread preen oils throughout their feathers. So at the base of their tail, they have a gland that produces an oil. So you can see him now, he's kind of preening at the back of his tail. Some of that oil will get on his bill and he will rub that oil throughout his feathers. It helps him to stay waterproofed. They'll use their toes for scratching and for also preening and getting their feathers back in place. They actually reach behind their wing. I don't know if you can make that out in the video, but he's not reaching in front. He reaches behind his wing to scratch. You can really see how those throat feathers can flare out too as he's preening. So now fall, and this is the season that is upon us. And this is the time of year that I mentioned when we'll see the most hummingbirds, because not only do we have the adults that may have been breeding here in the northeastern part of North America, but we also have the young. All of this year's offspring will be joining their parents on a migration down to the tropics. They do not travel together, however. The males, having no role in breeding or raising young, typically leave first. So you might notice that the first wave of hummingbirds through your feeder tend to be a lot of males. Later on in the season, we will get the females. They might linger a little longer as they complete raising their young and making sure their young are independent. And then the juveniles, this year's offspring, actually complete the migration on their own without their parents showing them the way, which is a pretty amazing thing to consider. There's that range map again. As I mentioned, the yellow is a migration route, but for a lot of birds that are breeding farther east, the quickest route is not going to be to fly all the way over here to Louisiana and Texas and down over land. The quickest route is going to be hopping right across the Gulf of Mexico. So many of these birds actually do make a non-stop flight across the Gulf of Mexico, 500 plus miles of flying from the Gulf Coast down to the Yucatan Peninsula. It's a non-stop flight that takes about 24 hours of flying. So it's really important that they fatten up before they go. This bird looks pretty hefty. This is probably maybe a fall bird that has gotten fattened up for his migration. They will nearly double their weight before they leave, like a butterball turkey. So they leave not really because it's cold. Here's a picture of my backyard in winter on a snowy day. And if you look at that, Georgia, and of course places farther north, that habitat does not have what a hummingbird needs in the winter. They can survive the cold. They can actually drop their body temperature and lower their heart rate and go into a torpor state to survive cold nights. But that's not the issue. They leave to follow their food source. So remember, they're eating flowers and insects, and those are kind of hard to come by in most parts of North America in the late fall and winter months. So during the winter months, they are down in the tropics. And my screen here shows one of two habitats that they might find when they arrive on their wintering grounds. Of course, a lot of the natural habitat of the tropics is rainforest, cloud forest, tons of biodiversity. So here we've got some rainforest habitat. And then of course, agriculture. Agriculture is necessary for humans worldwide. But when a hummingbird returns to his wintering grounds in the tropics, which of these two places do you think he's better going to have his needs met? In a rainforest or on agriculture fields? And I think the answer is probably obvious to all of us that the biodiversity of a rainforest is going to offer more places for shelter, more food, and more nectar sources. So some threats to hummingbird. As we wind up the program, I would like to empower everyone to take some simple actions to help hummingbirds in their own backyards and green spaces. Here are some of the major threats that we see to hummingbirds. Outdoor cats, of course, kill up to 2 billion birds each year. And so if you have a cat, we encourage you to keep your cat indoors or keep your cat supervised or in a catio when taking the cat outdoors. Windows are another huge threat to birds. Another 2 billion birds die or are injured in window collisions in North America each year. And in our Project Safe Flight Atlanta work, which is a program that we have monitoring some of the buildings that are the biggest threats to birds in our cities, we have found more hummingbirds as casualties than any other species. We found more than 100 different species, but of that diverse group of birds, hummingbirds seem to have the most trouble with windows. So treating your glass, you can see why this would be a problem for birds, right? Reflecting the trees. They really don't understand glass. So treating our glass, number of different ways you can do that. I think we have a webinar coming up on that soon. So Dottie can put the link in the comments. And if you're curious about that, go to our digital resources page to learn
Melanie,
more.
that webinar has actually already happened, but we will have
Summer.
a recording on our digital resources page within sometime next week.
Okay, excellent. So yes, I've lost track of time, but you will have access to that on our digital resources page if you are curious about that. Lights and light pollution is a big problem to birds because some birds, as I mentioned, are making possibly 24-hour migrations or more, maybe flying for days at a time without stopping to rest. So they do fly at night when they're migrating. And when they fly over a big city like Atlanta, the moon and the stars and the natural landmarks that they're using to guide them become obscured with our light pollution. And they often start to circle in confusion until they either come down and hit glass or they come down, but then in the next morning can't find the resources to get back up and get off again. So light pollution is a big threat to birds. And that's a really simple, easy thing we can all do to help birds, not just hummingbirds, but all birds, especially in spring and fall during migration, turning off lights at night. And then pesticides. We don't think about it maybe when we're spraying for mosquitoes, but we're poisoning basically the base of the food chain for birds. 99% of our birds are insectivores during the breeding season, both for themselves and to feed their nestlings and fledglings. So when we're poisoning insects, we are poisoning the food supply for our birds and all sorts of wildlife. Not only that, but when it rains, those toxins are falling into the soil, going into our groundwater. We're all connected. So we want to avoid poisons however we can. I mentioned recently that I help and volunteer with bird rehabilitation saw a very sad case recently of a hummingbird that we suspect had been poisoned by pesticides, probably feeding from flowers that maybe has been sprayed. The bird had a beautiful, healthy, robust physique, but his tongue was hanging out and he was on death's door, and there was no sign of injury. So we suspected pesticides. Some ways to help, as I mentioned, treating your glass, lots of great alternatives. Our webinar, I'm sure, mentions some of those great attractive alternatives for your windows. Probably the number one thing that you can do to improve habitat for birds is planting native plants. Here's an early spring blooming tree, red buckeye, or I think this is actually painted buckeye, which has flowers that hummingbirds love, but also because it's a native plant, it supports the insect life that hummingbirds and other birds rely on for themselves and raising their young. So choosing native plants for your landscape is another great way to help hummingbirds and other birds. No pesticides, as I mentioned, turning off your lights, choosing bird-friendly products like bird-friendly coffee. I mentioned that our hummingbirds are gone in the winter, right? They're down in the tropics. So they would prefer to live in a rainforest where coffee is grown in the shade rather than all of the trees cleared to grow coffee or other products. So making smart choices with our purchasing can help birds. And then, of course, a simple, easy way to help birds is putting up a feeder. You can enjoy them at close range by doing so, but of course, you also want to make sure you keep those feeders clean and be responsible in your bird feeding. Quick slide about gardening for hummingbirds. Again, choosing the native plants is going to provide not only flowers with nectar that the birds love, but it will support the insect life, the gnats and flies and micro moths that hummingbirds rely on, as well as other insects that other birds rely on. There's a short list there of some great hummingbird-friendly plants. Coral honeysuckle. You want to avoid the Japanese honeysuckle, which is not native and also is an invasive. It can take over and crowd out other plants. So be looking for native varieties when you're choosing these plants. Cardinal flower, bee balm, jewelweed is a great wildflower that's coming into bloom right now. It's a super important food source for birds on their fall migration. Trumpet vine, buckeye I mentioned, and Indian pink. There are lots more. Feeding hummingbirds, as I mentioned, it's super easy. It's a great way to bring them up close so you can admire them. We're going to be getting Sibley out and admiring him up close here in just a minute. But the best recipe for your feeder nectar is 4 parts of water with 1 part white table sugar, and only white table sugar. Honey and organic or brown sugars can harbor bacteria and other things more quickly sometimes than white sugars. They have other minerals and things that are not necessarily healthy additives for hummingbirds. So just stick with the white table sugar, heat it, it will last longer and kill all the germs. I like to make a big batch and keep it in the fridge and just put a little out each day so that it's not spoiling by sitting out days at a time. In hot weather, you want to be changing it probably every other day, if not every day. Think about if you would want to drink out of a glass of water sitting out in the hot sun for a day or more. I wouldn't. So our hummingbirds also appreciate clean, fresh nectar. I was going to show you here, if you can see me a little on your screen, my favorite type of feeder is this saucer style, because if you only fill it halfway, the wasps and bees can't get their short tongues down into it and give up competing with the hummingbirds. And you can just fill up a little bit at a time for the birds. They also have a moat that you can fill with water. There's a picture of one here. You can also buy them separately, but that keeps ants from coming down into your feeder. And other birds can get a drink as well. We have a little chickadee there getting a drink from an ant moat. I do not recommend putting grease or oils on your poles to avoid ants coming up to your bird feeders. Birds that land on their poles can get them on their feet. You saw earlier in the video, birds use their feet for preening, so then they're just rubbing that grease into their feathers. So no grease or oils near your feeder stations. And there we've got a little bird. See, we just have a little golden speckle there. Because of the light, we see that gold color. So as I mentioned, we do occasionally get wintering hummingbirds here. Rufous hummingbird is probably the most common that shows up here. But again, there's only going to be a handful across the state. There's probably more that go unreported. But those are birds that have maybe just their migration route has maybe gotten a little off and they've ended up in Georgia. They can survive cold weather with the help of our feeders and some warm days. They can make a living here. There's a Georgia Hummer study group that is interested in knowing about your winter hummer if you should have one show up. But there is no reason to take your feeder down at the end of the fall. Leave it up and see who shows up. Just keep the nectar fresh. You don't have to change it quite as often, of course, when in cold months. And I don't know, I will let Dottie let me know if there are questions. I'll answer questions, but I am going to hide my...
There are a couple of questions. Hold on. Somebody wanted to know how long the hummingbird's beak were. Do you know the answer to that? How long they are?
It's about an inch, a little over an inch, if I had to estimate. The females is slightly longer than the males. She is slightly larger than the male, probably to help her with laying eggs and brooding eggs and young. But
And how do you tell a immature bird from an adult bird?
So an immature male, you would notice some maybe green or colorful, like ruby and gold speckling starting to come in. A juvenile female would be hard to distinguish from an adult female. There are ways to do it. Hatch year birds, so a juvenile female and the male, their green feathers are also tinged with a brownish gold, which can be hard to see if you don't have a good pair of optics. And then also female birds are going to have some wear and tear. Adult females are going to have some wear and tear to their feathers by this time of year. They've tended young, they've been running around, gathering food, feeding young. So they have worn their feathers, whereas a juvenile female is going to look very fresh with her new feathers right now.
Melanie, is there an ideal place to hang a hummingbird feeder?
Where you can see it. And if you have birds fighting, hanging more than one, maybe one in the front, one in the back, spreading them out a little bit so that if you have a territorial bird, he can't, drive the other ones away from two feeders at once.
And where do they build their nests? About what height?
It ranges. I've seen them as low as, maybe 10 feet, but they can also be up in the tops of trees.
What I think you said just 3 to 5 years is the lifespan of a hummingbird, correct? What is the lifespan?
Average lifespan is 3.
Okay.
For a hummingbird to survive its first year, and especially its migration, when you consider it's migrating thousands of miles. I mean, a bird that leaves Florida and goes to the Yucatan is just across an ocean flying 500 miles. But you think about birds that are starting in Canada and going down to the tropics. For them even to survive their first year, I think is mind-boggling. But the average life is 3, and they can survive. The oldest recaptured ruby throat, I believe, was 10.
Great. And when will we start to see the birds beginning to migrate out of Georgia?
I think migration has already started here. We're already starting to see some migrating birds, I think. I've seen a lot of juveniles at my feeder, more than 2. So even though I think I might have had a pair hatch this year, I think some others have joined them. So they are already on the move. And I am joining now with my phone. I'm gonna leave. Stop share.
Oh, you're echoing, Melanie. Okay, there she goes. All right.
Okay, I'm gonna set my phone down for just a moment while I get Sibley out. So bear with me for just a second. Turn on the lighting. Oops. Can we see him, Dottie? I can't hear anybody. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you and we can
now I
see
hear you.
Sibley, and I was on mute. My apologies.
Okay. So this is Georgia Audubon's ambassador bird, Sibley. I'll give you a little bit of his background. He was injured in a window collision. I mentioned earlier that hummingbirds unfortunately suffer that fate all too frequently. He was rescued by a Good Samaritan and brought to Aware Wildlife Center, which takes in injured and orphaned wildlife. And unfortunately, because of the nature of his wing break, he was rendered flightless. He can no longer fly. And he serves as an education ambassador for Georgia Audubon. I had to apply for the permits to keep him. You can't just keep a wild bird. You have to get the permits from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. So that was a bit of an extensive process, but because of my experience volunteering and doing bird rehab, I was able to get the permits for Sibley to join us and do education. So when we aren't living in a pandemic, Sibley makes appearances occasionally at our monthly meetings. He goes out to hospitals and libraries and schools and does outreach for all sorts of groups, wherever there's an interest in learning about hummingbirds. So he can't fly, which we know. I mentioned earlier that hummingbirds can't walk, so his mobility is limited. He can shuffle, he can sidestep. So hummingbirds can sidestep along a perch. There he goes, just as if on cue, right, Sibley? He did a little shuffle. He can flutter and hop himself from perch to perch. He has a variety of perches in his enclosure. One of his favorite perches is just rubber bracelets. I've doubled them up there to make them a little thicker, but since he is on his feet a lot, I give him a variety of perches. That's also why I've got this chenille stick wrapped on the perch there, just to give him different widths and textures so that he doesn't get foot cramps from all the time that he spends on his feet. He can kind of flip himself around and get on another perch when we're moving him. I put his little band in front of him and he knows to just hop right up on it. He's ready to go. He likes riding in the car. He's got his own booster seat so that he can see out. And in spite of his limited mobility, he seems to be a pretty content little guy. He gets daily baths. We have a little garden here for him with flowers that we can pick for him daily. I catch spiders for him. I don't know if he's catching a piece of dust there or what, opening his mouth. But so he does get some fresh spiders in his diet. He is self-feeding. You'll see his little feeding system that I created. Actually, my friend Prue created it using some garden wire. And his nectar, you'll notice, is not clear. So not the sugar water that I told you to put in your feeders. Sibley needs protein, but he can't go out and catch insects freely. So he has a special nectar that is made with the powder that has the minerals and protein and vitamins that he needs to keep him healthy. And I also grind up fruit flies for him daily to add to his nectar. But he doesn't like the nectar with fruit flies quite as much as this nectar, and his favorite is the sugar water. So it's very interesting to see that he does have distinct taste preferences. The picture I showed you earlier of his full crop was I think after he'd had sugar water. So he always gorges when he gets dessert at night. Dottie, if there are any questions, I can't see what time it is on my phone while I'm holding it. So
I think
you
we're
let
doing
me know when
pretty
it's time to wrap it up.
People are enjoying. If you have any
too.
questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get to them.
So if you are interested in scheduling as a program similar to this to learn about hummingbirds and have Sibley make an appearance, you can contact me. My email is melanie.furr@georgiaaudubon.org. We would love to invite you all to support the work that we are doing for Georgia birds and across the state by joining us as a member. And then, of course, if you want to help donate to Sibley's care, you can go to our website, georgiaaudubon.org/donate. Dottie's going to correct me if I'm wrong because I don't have it handy in front of me.
Actually, the donate link is pinned to our top comment, so you can click on the link.
But we are very grateful for the Sugar Fund. Sibley and I are very grateful for contributions to the Sugar Fund.
Okay, well, I think we probably better wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This will be available on our Facebook page, and we will also download it and put it on our YouTube channel. Please allow a few days for us to download and edit it. But thank you, everybody, for coming. We've had a wonderful turnout. We apologize for all the Zoom bombing that was taking place. We were doing our best to delete those as fast as they came in. But thanks, everybody, for coming, and we hope you all enjoy the rest of your weekend. And thank you very much, Melanie and Sibley. Don't forget Sibley.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in.